Hey guys, welcome to our lesson on air medical operations. We're talking about air medical transport, either fixed wing or rotary wing, and all of the different benefits that we have in regards to the use of an aircraft for emergency patient transportation. We know that this has become a critical component of modern EMS, and so both helicopters and airplanes, we call those fixed wings, have the potential to be a vital asset in our emergency transport. So let's go ahead and get this lesson underway. Again, as we've just already discussed, we know that the use of the aircraft for emergency patient transport has become a critical component of what we consider the modern EMS system or practices. Helicopters and airplanes have been proven to be a vital asset in the transport of all ill or injured patients for a number of different reasons that we'll discuss here shortly. These include things such as response scene times. Primary we would look at would be things like air medical crews first on scene. Secondary would be where we have most commonly around here, where you'd have the practice of Air Care or Aeromed or any of those agencies for that matter actually being summoned. We also see the use for interfacility transport, where air medical transport teams pick up patients between different hospitals, typically from lower or mid-level care to advanced care. And then we notice that there's a ton of different types of aircraft that exist, and that type of aircraft is going to be chosen based on distance, patient condition, weather, a number of different factors along those lines. Now, we do know that the helicopter itself is limited to a distance of 150 to 200 miles. Beyond that, it's just not going to be able to make it. It won't be able to carry the fuel that it needs to. We also know that specialty care, air medical transport in this case, can bring specialty teams and teams to community hospitals, and for example, things like neonatal transport. We also see things like organ procurement teams. They'll use aircrafts to respond to a site of a donor and then actually transport their organs to the transport center where they can be harvested. Now, modern aircraft are going to have a lot of different components that we see. They're not just used just for medical transport, but they're also used for things such as search and rescue operations. In order to make these modern aircrafts effective, there has to be a lot of technology that goes into them to make sure that they're actually a valuable asset to us in EMS or for rescue purposes. These include things like making sure they have high intensity spotlights so they can see what's going on in the dark or in the distance. They can know what their landing zone looks like, identify hazards. They also need to have forward-looking infrared or FLIR, where they're actually able to operate without visual components. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then night vision goggles so they can actually see at night. Now, disaster assistance is one of the things that we oftentimes don't think about air medical transport operations, but they do serve a role. Most of these situations, particular helicopters, can provide a lot of access to disaster regions or even to help transport folks that otherwise may not be able to if it's a mass casualty incident, especially much more than ground ambulances. We also know that air medical transport must be used responsibly. It's not meant to be called and for every call that you run, every trauma, we don't launch the aircraft. However, we need to be smart about using our resources. There is a time and a place for us to implement air medical transport. Either a patient who's critical or needs specialized resources that we're not able to get them to or provide ourselves. Or in that case, you would look at things like blood products or rapid sequence innovation. Maybe you have a prolonged extrication and you know that they're going to be able to provide more advanced care on scene than you can at an ALS level. We also want to make sure that you're familiar with your local protocols for medical direction and the capabilities and usage of air medical transport. Now, there's a long history when we think about helicopters and flight, aviation, when it comes to medical care. Air medical transports originally was designed and developed from the military, and we know this is primarily operating with both as early as World War I, but primarily more so along the lines of what we think of today as in Vietnam. First recorded use of an airplane to evacuate the wounded casualties was in World War I. That was done by a French aircraft. We know that there was air ambulances again that were utilized by the French and the British during the African and Middle Eastern colonial wars of 1920. So quite a long time ago they were being used. The first actual successful operation of the helicopter was this, I can never say this, Sikorsky YR4, which was built in the United States, right? Yay, back in 1942. That helicopter was actually used in 1945, was documented to be the first medical evaluation. We were thinking of along the lines with the jungles of Bermuda for Vietnam. In the 1950s, helicopter usage became common as we started to recognize aerial observation platform and for medical evacuation of infantry casualties. So again, our basis for today's modern air medical transport was founded primarily through the fact of human war. In Korea, we know that patients were evacuated from battlefields to a mobile army surgical hospital or a MASH unit. If you've had a chance to watch the show MASH, it kind of gives you an idea what you're talking about. And in 1960, mass production of powerful gas turbine engines allowed for the design of a much more powerful and larger helicopter. Again, they can carry more passengers, they can carry more equipment, and travel further distances. Battlefield casualties ride inside the helicopter now and receive in-flight care. For a while, we used to pick them up, again, back in Vietnam, using MASH units as an example, where they were actually put on the outside of the helicopter and just transported. Now we see that they're actually providing transport and care while en route, while in flight. Medical evaluation, from evacuation of battlefield casualties by helicopter, we call this a dust-off. This was used heavily during the Vietnam War. That's where we see primarily, again, the focus for today's modern air medical transport. And then civilian use of aircraft for medical evaluation and care we see regularly used in rural areas. We may not actually have a ground transporting service in certain areas because of how rural and remote the access could be to folks in that area. And so we have to have some form of transport for them. We also have Australia that developed the Royal Flying Doctor Service, or the RFDSs. It's again a form of paramedics, but they're primarily focusing on rescue and providing medical care in the lines of being a physician, if that makes sense. There is a couple shows on YouTube, or not probably YouTube, but Netflix that outline what it's like in Australia when these physicians do these rescues and serve as a paramedic would here in the United States. 1947, we know that the Schaefer, I can't say that either, ambulance service in Los Angeles was the first air ambulance service to take off in the United States. They were the first use of an aircraft certified by the FAA, or the Federal Aviation Administration, as far as being an actual ambulance. 1970, Congress passed legislation creating the Military Assistance to Safety in Traffic, or the MAST program. And then in 1970, again, the Maryland State Police established their first non-military helicopter for medical evacuation program, a training program. 1972, St. Anthony's Hospital in Denver founded the first civilian helicopter air medical ambulance. They call it the Helicopter Air Ambulance, or HAA program, where they call it Flight for Life. 2001, Medicare increased reimbursement for helicopter ambulance rides and transports, allowing for growth in community-based non-hospital sector for services. Most of the places that we deal with air medical transport here locally in Michigan are hospital-based or are at least affiliated with one or more hospitals. In 2010, 730 HAA bases were finally established. We had 730 locations for aircrafts to take off from and 900 aircrafts that were active in the United States. As far as 2015, the FAA determined helicopter EMS as an actual term, or HEMS, no longer is utilized. It's obsolete. Now we're referring to them as helicopter air ambulance, or an HAA. That's the term that we now would call them. The aircraft itself, we see a multitude of types, primarily in makes and models, I should say. The primary types of aircraft you're going to see will be either fixed wing or rotary wing. We don't see fixed wing transport here locally very often because we have so many large trauma centers and a very large healthcare system here in Michigan that patients and EMS providers have access to. But in some areas, if a patient needs to go from the U of M to Columbus, or maybe they need to fly to Los Angeles for some type of specialized research or specialized care, they're going to need to be able to do that, and a helicopter is not always the best choice. So fixed-wing aircrafts provide additional comfort. They're faster, a lot more range compared to that of a ground ambulance, or even for that a rotary wing aircraft. Speaking of rotary wing aircraft, they are able to access hard to reach situations. They're able to transport often quicker than ground ambulances, and they can obviously get to places where a fixed wing aircraft could not. Choices of aircraft really are based on things like distance of transport, medical needs, patient condition, availability, prolonged scene time. I'll add to that. All of those become a major consideration. Now, when we think about a fixed-wing aircraft specifically, we call them airplanes. That's what they're referred to as. And these are vehicles that are capable of flight but use fixed wings to generate lift. Speed, much more significant than that of a helicopter. Typically, they're going to be run off a turbine engine or piston engines, and that's similar to what you would see in a rotary helicopter, but the design is slightly different. And you may also see turboprop systems, which is energy that's diverted from the turbine to power the propeller if it has a propeller on the plane as well. We also know that there's jet propulsion systems. These are turbine powered by rotary air compressors, and then it compresses incoming air and exhaust gases and ejects those out via specific ducts, and that gives us a significant amount of thrust in those circumstances. That ejected gases, again, is the propulsion that's used to move that aircraft. Fixed-wing aircrafts, most air ambulance turbine power, they have at least 2 engines, which is kind of neat because you wouldn't necessarily know that. They allow for pressurized cabins. They allow for safe and comfortable travel at very high altitudes. Because the cabin is pressurized, that makes a big difference in our patients who are intubated or may have some type of balloon pump, or even the lumen on your endotracheal tube can make transport much more simple, I guess you could say, as far as not having to add fluid or water or adjust anything based on pressures. Larger than helicopters, obviously, and they can take a lot more patients. They can take several patients at a time. Typically, most of your rotary wing are going to take 1, potentially up to 2. We also know that they must land and take off in airports. That limits our capabilities as far as using their resources in remote areas. Airports are obviously not always in close proximity to the hospital or to a scene. And when patients are transported by ground ambulance to an air medical fixed-wing rotary, they'll have to meet the aircraft at the airport, and then from there turn over care, and then the aircraft will take off and fly to wherever it needs to. And then again, once they receive at the airport, they'll need to have another ground ambulance to transport them out back to the hospital. Rotary wing aircraft, helicopters use rotary blades, right? Or that's a rotor, that's what provides the lift as they spin. The main rotor system is supplemented by a tail rotor, which basically prevents them from having that natural torque where they would spin in a circle. It allows them to stay and maneuver themselves whichever way they need to by that rotary blade. All helicopters using EMS, at least here in the United States, are powered by a turbine or powered by a jet engine. Most EMS helicopters have a single pilot, some have more. They do have a lot of limitations. You can't take a helicopter up into storms. You can't take a helicopter up into lightning or even significant wind or rain for that matter. Where with fixed wing, you are able to fly above those. Rotary wing are actually going to fly into them, and it's sometimes very hard for them to get above that cloud level. They are going to be able to fly under visual flight rules, so they typically have to have the ability to see or get clearance to fly under the instrumental flight rules, where they're basically going to fly based on computer feedback and radar. Most programs limit to flying under visual flight rules, right? So they have to actually fly where they can see. If they can't see, they can't fly. It's only meant to be for certain circumstances where they can actually plot it out. They know they've got a secure landing spot or helipad. There are a lot of limitations on how they can operate under that instrument flight rules. Weather conditions, again, require that it's going to be safe when they fly, and it can also affect you if they are on their way to you and weather looks bad all of a sudden, they may no longer be able to get to you. Again, it's going to vary based on terrain, lighting, day or night, distance from their home base. A lot of different factors will affect whether they can actually get to you safely or not. Most programs are capable and trained to fly under infrared or instrument flight rules and conditions, but they again have very significant limitations that they can use those and how they use that technology. Not generally able to fly on instruments to random points in the ground, right? They have to have a fixed point that they can fly because there's limitations to the technology and there's limitations to the way that the computer system works within a helicopter. Best thing you can do if you're not able to get to transport or they're delayed or there's a weather issue is to consider ground transport. The ability to fly by infrared radar is going to be, or instrumental flight rules is going to be where there's a lot more options should the weather change while they're flying with a patient or taking off or have the weather changes once they're on scene. That gives them the ability to be able to fly and finish a transport safely in those conditions. It's best to call through the channels to make the request. Some aircrafts have applications you can use. Some medical controls require you to get permission prior to launching the bird. Some people have statements of who can and who can't activate. Locally, I can speak to Air Care. Air Care is always willing to be put on standby. And standby doesn't mean that they're just going to go, okay, we'll sit here and just kind of sit in the base and wait till you tell us to come. They will pull the helicopter out. They will fire it up. They will warm it up. They will be prepared to launch. And then once you tell them, they will immediately lift off. It does take about 10 minutes or so to 15 minutes for a helicopter to get prepped and ready to take off and even to land. And those are considerations when you are thinking about when you should call them or the amount of time it would take for you to transport via ground. Again, it allows the pilot to be able to evaluate the situation using resources at their disposal to make the best informed decision. The last thing you want to do is get out there and get in trouble and end up causing a major catastrophe of crashing of an aircraft just because we took a chance on the weather. Now, helicopters as the ambulances are not limited to airports, so they can take off wherever they need to or they can land wherever they need to. Again, weather permitting, they can land almost anywhere, retrieve patients, and transport them to a trauma center or to additional hospitals. The use of helicopters and airplanes in the United States EMS system has been evolving and has been in utilizations in the last 40 years. In 2001, the federal government changed reimbursement scheme for air medical transport. It resulted in a significant increase in the number of air ambulances because there was more funding available for reimbursement for private services rather than just hospital-based services. There's been a large transition from hospital-based models to community-based models, hospital operations to for-profit operations. So we've got to kind of recognize that the trend is there, that these are still they're affiliated with a hospital, but they are operating independently. They're operating with their own protocols. They're operating with their own guidelines, their own service areas, things of that nature. Now, how do we use air medical transport in EMS? What is the role in which it plays? Well, there are a ton of uses. Obviously, they're used in initial use of medical hospitals were primarily medical helicopters, were primarily used for trauma care, and that's still the case today. But we've seen that expand over recent years, over the last decade, where we're seeing helicopters now being used for interfacility transports. That we're seeing specialization of skills to come directly to the scene. Or even to additional hospitals like rural hospitals or level 4 trauma centers or just tertiary hospitals. The goal here was that we had effective, efficient, timely methods of moving patients besides ground, because we know that oftentimes we can transport via ground and we can do so safely, but the time it will take could be drastically longer. We also know that because patient needs care of specialized centers does not mean patients must be transported by helicopter or airplane. So just because a patient needs specialized care or a specialized center doesn't mean they have to have an airplane or a helicopter to do so. You're capable as a paramedic to do a lot of those things. Patients with traumatic cardiac arrest, very, very poor prognosis. Do not call a helicopter for someone who's in cardiac arrest from a trauma. We don't even typically work those folks anymore. So we have to recognize that just because someone has died in an accident and it's a motor vehicle accident doesn't mean that we need to have a helicopter there for us. Things like prolonged extrication, other components or specialized resources that are needed at the scene, or transport is delayed by ground for whatever reason, air is a great option to consider. There are some benefits. Here they are. Speed, decrease out of hospital time, we increase the quality of care that's provided, and we have rapid access to specialized care. More so than we would by ground ambulance transporting agencies. There's also limitations. We know that flights may be impossible during inclement weather. We may also see where ground transport may be the only option that you have if there's no one available or the weather or conditions don't permit flight. It's also very expensive. Typically, it's about $10,000 to $15,000 to take a ride in a helicopter if you're a patient, and that's minimum, and it goes up from there. So we have to recognize that. Because again, just like we have to be available and in service at all times, so does air medical transport. That includes things like aircraft maintenance, making sure there's adequate training for medical and aviation crews. We got to have that 24/7 staffing and then availability for them to take off, along with fuel and insurance, medical supplies, you name it. The list goes on and on and on. Space limitations are another component. We can only take so much stuff with us, so large of patients, so many patients, because most of these aircrafts are small to medium-sized helicopters. We also have the ability to carry morbidly obese patients, where it's quite limited as well, because they have to account for their weight. In order to get lift, you can only have so much weight. And sometimes you need more fuel to travel further distances, which means you need to be able to carry more fuel weight. The more weight you carry, the less your patient can weigh in order for you to get lift. Patients who are quite tall or who maybe have a traction split on, they may not actually fit into the helicopter. Now, most of the newer aircrafts around here will fit those cases, but not always throughout the United States. We also know that staffing is important. There's a group of three in a crew, that consists of the pilot and then 2 medical providers. Here's something important to know. The pilot never knows what they're going to, what the call is, how bad the patient is, none of that. Because they want to make sure the pilot flies objectively, flies based on regular routine procedures, not focusing on the emergency, not focusing on the need for rapid or increased expedite transport. 90% of the helicopter ambulances programs, again, are going to consist of paramedics and nurses. Most of the folks around here you're going to find are going to be paramedic RNs, or you'll see something like a PA or a physician that will actually be on the flight crew as well. Not always, but generally you're going to see that they're going to have 5 years of critical care nursing experience, at least a good significant career in EMS as a paramedic as well. The crew of the pilot and the single medical provider are inadequate except for transport of extremely stable patients. It's pretty rare for that to happen where you just have one provider and the pilot. Physician nurses staffing model is more common outside of the United States, where we see physicians that are flying in the helicopters with nurses, and EMS is not as prevalent in those cases. There are a couple controversies when we think about air medical transport and EMS. There's this perceived increased rate and incidence of crashes involving medical helicopters. Many helicopters based in close proximity to one another, right? Raising the question, do we really need all of those? Are they all truly medically necessary? And then there's a significant increase in accident and fatality rate in case something were to occur. So we have to recognize that there are some controversies of, is this the most effective tool to use? It has its place and it serves its purpose. Then we have the Patient First Air Ambulance Alliance. It's where we see medical and aviation providers kind of come together. Basically ensures that critically ill and injured patients have access to the safest and highest quality form of air medical transport possible. Additional controversies for that, there are programs that are using night vision goggle technology. There are programs that are not. There are the adoption of GPS-based helicopters, specific terrain avoidance warning systems that they have. They also have enhanced ground proximity warning systems. If you get a chance to watch Sully Sullenberg, played by Tom Hanks, when he's landing on the Hudson, you can hear the enhanced ground proximity alerts that are basically saying, warning, warning, pull up, impending proximity warning, pull up, and it's warning them because of that. Now, it's a fixed wing, but that also exists for rotary devices as well. Radar, we know that radar is going to be a component that we want to see, especially as we're trying to do things up off the ground, right, as we get into higher level altitudes. And then all of these tools are approved, have to have an approval process for safety. But mostly you're going to see that these things are not going to be mandated by the FAA, unfortunately, to be on all EMS helicopters. The goal is those are great to have. They're also expensive and hard to maintain, and that's why some services just don't have those. Again, locally we have these. And then local and state governments have the little authority to regulate what actually happens with air ambulances, what they do, how they operate. It's all kind of independent. Now, the FAA has exclusive authority to regulate the operation of air ambulances. Air ambulances fall under the authority and purview of the Airline Deregulation Act. Basically what that means is that there's no single uniformly recognized certifying organization for an air medical industry. And that's what has led to so many of these other private services popping up. So let's now switch gears a little bit and talk about how we operate on a scene. Based on our initial information, we're going to get dispatched, we're going to recognize what's going on, and we're going to recognize that we need the use for air medical transport. And again, there are guidelines that you have for that. There's a number of links in this lesson that will allow for you to see what the specific requirements are for launching air care as a reference. These include locating the scene, right? We got to get them to your location. We got to recognize where you are. Some of these have a lot of really cool apps where you click the app, it recognizes where you're at, and it tells them right where to get there, how long it's going to take. You name it, to give you all that detailed information. If you don't have that, you're going to need things like cross streets or closest roads. You're going to need maybe from there closest towns or cities, along with maybe the actual address, and then any well-known landmarks that might be in the air or in the area, that would allow for the crew to identify where you're at. We need to make sure we provide additional information for launch. This includes requesting an agency that you've identified. You contact them typically by radio. You know their radio frequencies. They've got some way to communicate back and forth with you. Also depends on weather conditions, hazardous materials that may be present, and number of patients. So there's going to have to be some basic medical descriptions that are necessary. So you have to be careful who calls when they call. You don't want to be an MFR that has no idea what's going on. They just want to be in an aircraft. You're going to want to get that additional information. So making that call is typically something you would do as a paramedic. We also have to have a place to land safely. So we have to be able to have a landing zone. Part of the National Incident Management System and the Incident Command System, an LZ officer, a landing zone officer, should be designated. The LZ officer coordinates the incoming aircraft's operations with the commander for the incident. Typically, LZs are set up by the fire department, so when you think about launching the helicopter, you also have to think about making sure you've got fire available to land them as well. When you're thinking about a landing zone, you got to pick an appropriate site. You got to make sure that site is properly prepared. That includes things like no loose soil. It can't be boggy or wet where the aircraft would sink, or unstable ground. It has to be relatively level ground. There's a lot of things that come into play with that. We also want to make sure that we watch for things like power lines or any hazards that might be in the area as well that may need to be protected. Typically, ideally, you're going to have a 100 by 100 square feet area with little to any slope. You need to have clear of any type of debris or obstructions. And if there's a dusty area, you may want to consider wetting it down with water, like in a fog pattern or something from a fire truck that would allow for that dust not to blow back up, because that really can blind you and cause more problems than it does good. But it's never a good idea to take that charged hose and have it fixed on the aircraft. Last thing you want to do is have water hit that aircraft if it's not necessary. If it catches fire, it's going to catch fire. Typically, one little hose is not going to make a difference in helping, but it could definitely make an impact on hurting the scene. We also know that we never are going to approach helicopter, depending on the type of helicopter at least, when the blades are moving. That's a pretty good rule of thumb. We don't typically see hot loads, we would call them, where their fixed wings are still rotating. Some services still do, but most don't. So approach and the landing zone should be made typically where they're going to be as near into the wind as possible or practical. There should be markers on the from the upwind side of the LZ. Typically they're going to fly into the wind and then come land down. That's how they'll be able to do that. And then typically you'll mark that with either cones during the day or some type of strobes. We used to use flares, and flares are really not indicated as much as they used to be. We don't ever want to shine lights up towards the aircraft because that's going to blind them just like it would blind you. and then avoid certain colored strobes as well. It's best to see things like red, but green and blue often can be difficult to see if they're using night vision goggles. Red and white are probably the most easiest to see with night vision goggles, and then again, like I said, avoid using flares. The LZ security is critical. From the time of the initial approach until the aircraft departs, we want to make sure that that scene remains safe and nobody's coming in or out of it, especially during takeoff or landing. Non-essential personnel in all vehicles and equipments must be kept clear from that LZ area. And then again, have personnel walk the LZ to look for any type of debris or obstructions, dangers, slopes, soft spots, anything that could affect the aircraft from landing or taking off. And then look up as well. Not only look down, but look up. Do you have any obstructions, wires, trees, poles, you name it? What exists there? We also look for what's called the hot saw. That's just another acronym that we use in EMS here, right? Not that we don't have enough, but this is what we're looking for to identify to the oncoming crew of hazards potentially as they begin to land the aircraft. What hazards do they have? Are there obstructions? What type of terrain or surface are they dealing with? Are there any animals in the area? And then what type of wind and weather are we actually working with? Now, as the helicopter approaches, the LZ officer should remain in contact with them throughout the entire landing for the most part. Oftentimes, the medical crew may call for an update. That's a little bit different than communicating with the pilot as they're planning, or co-pilot as they're planning for a safe landing. During the night landings, again, turn off as many flashing lights as you can. Use spotlights to mark any type of obstacles. Again, don't shine them up, but try to identify them by shining light onto them. And do not shine lights or lasers ever at the helicopter. Makes it very hard and will affect their equipment as they try to land. Night vision imaging systems, or your night vision goggles, are going to obviously make it easier for them to see at night, but it makes it harder for them to see if there's excessive amounts of light. The crew may request that scene lights are turned off so they can ensure a safe landing. Notify the crew also when you hear the aircraft and when you're able to see it. That gives them an idea that they can see you, potentially start to look for you as well. And then, although you can see the aircraft, most likely they're not going to be able to see you. They're visible much, much further out than they can physically actually see you. If necessary, help the aircraft land, right? Use clock-based terms, directional terms, things of that nature. And the term abort landing is a common terminology used, a common phrase for a pilot to know that to obviously abort the landing, something has become unsafe. Never, ever allow anyone to approach the aircraft until the crew indicates that it's safe to do so. Them exiting the aircraft does not indicate that it's safe, right? It just indicates they're exiting. They will tell you when you can come up or not. Typically, you should wait completely until the rotary wings have stopped, and then at that point, the crew will signal to you to come up. Just don't randomly approach the aircraft. Always remain well outside the rotary perimeter. Obviously, it's not safe to do so, and the pilot may or may not leave the helicopter running. Those are considered hot loads. That's not a typical thing with most services because of the liability. However, there are agencies, private agencies, public agencies for that matter, that do hot loads on occasion. Never, ever, ever should anyone approach from the rear of the helicopter. You got to remember that rotary blade is one thing, right? And as it slows, those blades are going to dip down, and that's what makes it so dangerous. In the back, that rotary is spinning on a vertical axis, and when it does so, if you were to approach it from the rear, it's very easy you could get decapitated or worse. As you look at your helicopter approach, right, there's caution areas, there's danger areas. Again, the front and the back, we typically are not going to come from. We're going to only go from the sides of the aircraft. If you're going to come in, make sure that primarily from the front, make sure the crew can see you. And again, the rotary wings need to be still. If the aircraft is on any type of unlevel ground, obviously you want to approach from the downhill side. That would be the safest way. And then walk away from the aircraft in the exact same direction that you approached it from. Allow the crew to open the doors and remove the equipment, and you assist them on what they need. Ask before you just reach and help. Patient handoff. Do not bring the patient to the helicopter. That's not how it works. Let the crew come to the patient and then help you package them properly, and then they will get them back to the aircraft for transport with you. Once they land, don't overwhelm them. Let them finish what they need to do to safely exit the aircraft. They'll come to you. At that point, you can turn over care appropriately, or they may begin care, and then you can assist them in the loading and takeoff components that they need. Again, give a brief, concise report of the patient's condition, the care you provided, the detailed response to the care that the patient has had, report whatever medication and the dosing that you administered, and a copy of any type of patient's identification, vital signs, or other physiological data that you can provide to them. It's always a great tool. As you're loading the aircraft, you will assist them in loading the patient. Follow the safety rules, again, for approaching and leaving the aircraft, coming from the front, never the rear, and depending on if it's a side load, there's some components there as well. Same path in, same path out. Don't ever hold any equipment above shoulder height, right? So don't carry something up like this, right? Keep everything down as much as you can, and then follow the directions of the flight crew. That's probably the most important advice I could give you. Depending on the aircraft, the way in which it loads will be specific. Some helicopters load from the side. This was common with the older aircraft that AirCare had. Now they actually have a rear loading aircraft. Same thing with the U. We also know that allow the crew to close and secure doors and outside compartments. Let them handle that. And then critically important for us to avoid the tail of the aircraft. And I know I've said that a couple times now, but stay away from that rotary tail. It will really cause major issues. And then don't ever get your ambulance more than 25 feet away from the aircraft, right? Again, your landing zone should be 100 by 100. So that means 100 by 100, the closest you should get to your ambulance would be 25 feet. And then you would have to move back out of that LZ for them to take back off. Once the crew has secured the patient, leave the LZ, remain at a safe distance. You can watch, take photos, whatever you need to do, or get back in service. Be alert for open doors or compartments or straps that are left hanging out. If that's the case, you should identify it immediately and notify the pilot that there's a hazard. And then remain in contact with the aircraft until it's well clear of the area. So in summary, air ambulances are an important role in modern EMS. It helps establish rapid, definitive transport and definitive care brought directly to the patient in specific circumstances. Like any medical procedure, transporting a patient by helicopter is going to require considerations and of potential benefits and the risks. You have to weigh that. We know that because of their inherent danger and the cost of using medical aircraft, the potential benefits must clearly outweigh the risks. And so you must be a patient advocate, not only in the resources that are needed for that patient, but consideration of the resources of that service in general. Patients are often going to be unfamiliar with the role that a helicopter plays in EMS. They depend on you, the paramedic, to act in their best interest and to ensure that they're called when it's appropriate and given the right circumstances. So hopefully you've got a good understanding of what we're looking at with air medical operations. We're going to spend some time as well through this lesson dealing with AirCare's landing zone training and having you complete a couple tasks that are associated with that. I look forward to catching you guys on our next lesson.